There were 8 of us the morning they took us to Pen 11. I say 8 because that is the accurate count, but it never felt like 8, it felt like a squad, which is a different kind of number. You understand a squad not by counting, but by the particular silence that forms when all of you are standing in a line, and the same thought is moving through each of you without anyone having said a word. We had been together for 11 months by then. 11 months of the Vithrani Combined Arms Academy, which is what they called the installation at the edge of the Dovrath Plateau, a flat-topped escarpment of iron-gray stone that caught the wind from 2 directions and kept the cold longer than anything around it. The buildings were low and severe, the color of old bone. The corridors smelled of something between machine oil and the particular mineral sharpness of a species that sweats through its neck glands. We had gotten used to it. We had gotten used to a great many things. The 8 of us were second-year cadets in the combined track, which is what the academy called the stream that mixed human enrollees with Korathi, Ves, and Dralic students, who had been selected for advanced placement. The logic of the combined track was that future officers would serve alongside species they had never encountered in training, and it was thought better to produce the friction early, where it could be monitored. The friction had been educational for everyone, but in ways the curriculum designers had not fully anticipated. We had learned a great deal about our fellow cadets. Our fellow cadets had learned a great deal about us. My name is Sira Yildiz. I was 22 years old that morning. I was the squad's designated navigator and the one with the highest marks in environmental assessment, which was a polite way of saying I was good at reading terrain and deciding quickly what would kill us and in what order. I had grown up on Vosterath, second station, a colony world with a threat index of 5.4 on the Federated scale, which measured everything from atmospheric hostility to native fauna pressure to infrastructure fragility. On Vosterath, we had all 3. The colony was established on a plateau not entirely unlike this one, though warmer and lower, and below the plateau there were things with hard exoskeletons and patient dispositions that came up the escarpment walls at night if the deterrent arrays went down. They went down often in my childhood. You learned quickly to hear the difference between the sound of the array cycling normally and the sound of the array preparing to fail. It is a small distinction. It matters. The others had their own histories. Quaim Assant ran point, because Quaim was the kind of person obstacles moved aside for rather than waited to be broken by. He was from Durath 7, which had a standard gravity 12% above the Federated norm, and a biome that the Federated survey documentation described as, in its understated way, richly competitive. Quaim was built the way people from high-gravity worlds are built, not taller than average, but with a density of structure that registered in a room even when he was standing still, which he did often. He had been in the Academy's advanced placement stream since orientation week, and he was the reason the Korathi cadets in our cohort stopped treating the human section as a resource to be leveraged after the combat systems evaluation in month 4, when he had run the Keth class simulation at a calibration tier intended for 4th-year students, and had emerged asking the monitoring technician whether there was a harder setting. There was not. The calibration architecture was revised. Priya Chakraborty ran our communications, because Priya could hold 2 radio frequencies in her head simultaneously, and still carry on a conversation in a 3rd language without pause. She was from Kessler's Edge, which was a colony at the outer range of the Federated survey grid, where the communication relays were 47 hours out of sync with the core network, and so every conversation you had was with information that was already old when it arrived. This produced in the people who grew up there a particular capacity for inference, for filling in what was missing, for reading a partial signal and knowing what the full signal said. Priya read rooms the way she read transmissions. She rarely said what she thought was happening. She said what was confirmed. Dmitry Volkov handled ordnance assessment, which suited him, because Dmitry spoke very little and read danger the way other people read text quickly, without moving his lips. His home was a settlement on the Atrath Shelf, a pressurized world where the infrastructure was mostly underground, and the surface was mostly weather. And the thing you learned from early childhood was not to trust what you could see, because what you could see was the surface, and the surface was not where the situation lived. He had a particular stillness when he was uncertain about something that you learned, after a while, to treat as more informative than most people's explicit warnings. Yusuf Tambali was our medic. He had grown up on Harath's Landing, a colony where the nearest surgical facility was 4 days of overland travel across terrain that argued against overland travel at every stage of the journey. By the time Yusuf was 16, he had closed more wounds than the Academy's first-year medical rotation produced in a full semester. He spoke about his work with a practical flatness that took some people aback, and that I recognized from the first week as the voice of someone for whom the work had never been abstract. B. Santos ran rear security and spoke less than Dimitri, which was notable because Dimitri spoke very little. What she said once, and she was right about it. Her home colony was Vestran Hold, a second-generation settlement on a moon with significant native fauna pressure. The local biology was heavy-bodied and territorial, and had a particular disregard for colony perimeter infrastructure that the first generation had tried to address with barriers, and the second generation had addressed instead by learning to read the fauna. B's family had been reading it for 3 generations. She had the posture of someone who had learned early that you did not turn your back on large animals regardless of what structural material separated you from them. She was not alarmed by things other people were alarmed by. She was alert to things other people had not yet learned to see. Takeshi Mori was our technical specialist. Evaluations, diagnostic systems, the careful work that required patience and a willingness to sit with ambiguity until it resolved into something actionable. He was from Morikaigan Station, which orbited a gas giant at an orbital distance that produced a 22-hour day divided between 14 hours of useful solar access and 8 hours of hard radiation shadow. The station ran on 4-hour sleep cycles and shift rotations that nobody from a standard environment origin could manage without medication. Takeshi had grown up on them. He had the kind of precision that comes from people who have lived in systems where the margin for error is not a design feature, but an engineering constraint. And there was Oren, whose full name was Oren Kessler-Mar, and who had come to us from the outer settlement belt, a string of small colonies on low-gravity moons that were short-staffed enough that children did adult work by the time they were 8. He had the particular quality of being entirely unimpressed by things designed to impress, which was useful in an academy that frequently tried to impress people. He also had, though I only understood this fully later, a particular stillness around living things that he did not have anywhere else. The ease of someone who had spent significant time in the company of large working animals and had learned that the way you were around them mattered more than the distance you kept from them. 8 humans in a line, on a cold plateau, 11 months into a 2-year program designed to produce officers for the Federated Combined Forces. We were not the only humans in the combined track. There were 26 of us across the 3 second-year sections, drawn from 17 different origin worlds, ranging in age from 19 to 28. What distinguished our squad of 8, and I noticed this only in retrospect, fitting the pieces together after Pen 11, was that not one of us was from a standard environment origin world. Every one of us came from a colony where the threat index was at least 4.5. Most of us were above 5. The Academy's placement algorithm had grouped us by performance metrics and aptitude assessment, and the kind of deep-cut psychometric data that the federated enrollment system collected and processed and fed into assignment models without explaining its reasoning to the humans it was sorting. It had put us together without, I think, entirely understanding why we fit. The morning of Pen 11 began like the others. Formation at the 5th hour, assessment brief at the 6th, assignment to practical rotation at the 7th. The practical rotations were the Academy's version of applied learning, which meant the curriculum had decided you had absorbed enough theory, and now it was time to put you in proximity to something that could hurt you and see what happened. We had been through 12 rotations by then. We had done pressure lock navigation, combat systems integration, hostage scenario arbitration, survival infrastructure construction in 2 different climate profiles, and 4 variations of what the Academy called wilderness persistence, which the 8 of us privately called a walk. The wilderness persistence rotations were designed to test stress endurance, resource management, and decision-making under environmental duress. They ran for 72 hours in fabricated hostile terrain. They had a 40% completion rate across the combined track. Our section completed them at 100%. We had not mentioned this to anyone. It had been noticed anyway. The 13th rotation was Predator Handling and Management. The briefing officer was Instructor Kavith Saul, a VES, which meant she stood about 2.5 meters at the shoulder and had the kind of forward-set eyes that tracked movement the way a hunting bird's did, not by scanning, but by locking briefly, with the absolute certainty of something that did not need to look twice. She had been at the Academy for 11 years. She ran the Predator track with the efficiency of someone who had seen every possible student reaction and had organized her curriculum around the complete set of them. She stood at the front of the briefing room and she did not look at us for the first 3 minutes. She was looking at her notes, or at something behind us, or at nothing in particular, the VES equivalent of giving a room time to settle, which had taken us several months to read correctly. When she did look at us, her lock eyes moved across the row slowly, pausing on each face for less than a second. Pen 11, she said, houses a Velith-class Predator, adult male, 14 years of age, which is middle-range maturity for the species. He has been in residence at this facility for 9 of those 14 years. His name in the handler records is Torek. He responds to it, though that should not be taken as evidence of domestication. He is not domesticated. He has been conditioned, which is a meaningfully different thing. She turned to the display panel behind her. The image that appeared was approximately what you would get if you took a Predator already built for terminal efficiency, and then continued building it past the point where you thought you were done. Torek was 6 meters from snout to tail base, not counting the tail itself, which was another 2.5 meters of articulated muscle, and a fin strike tip that the display notation described as capable of producing 300 kilograms of force at full extension. He was low to the ground, the way a river is low, not because he was small, but because that was where his center of gravity lived, close to the substrate, coiled in a way that made resting and launching feel like the same thing. His coat was the blue-black of deep water where the light doesn't reach, and across his flanks there were bioluminescent markings that the display told us activated under threat state arousal, producing a visual signal the behavioral literature compared to a broadcasting antenna, and the handler documentation compared to a countdown. He had 6 limbs. The front 4 were locomotion and grip, the rear 2 were pure propulsion. His jaw structure featured 2 articulated rows of dentition with independent movement, which was a description that took a moment to fully resolve into its implications. The display included a structural cross-section. The implications became clearer. Kavith Saul, let us look at the image for a while. In 23 years of operation, she said, this facility's Pen 11 rotation has produced 0 successful independent handler assessments at the cadet level. The rotation is not designed to produce success. It is designed to produce data. You will enter the Pen observation area. You will observe Torek at standard proximity, and you will complete a behavioral assessment form that will be evaluated by the permanent handler team. You will not enter the Pen floor. You will not interact with Torek directly. You will observe. She paused. He will also observe you. There was a quality to the way she said that last sentence that was different from the rest of the brief, quieter, more deliberate, closer to something personal than something procedural. I noted it and filed it. Any questions before transport? Dmitri raised his hand. What happened to the cadets who tried to enter the floor? Kavathsal looked at him for a moment. That question is answered in the post-incident reports, which are available in the restricted archive. I recommend reading them after, not before. She said nothing further. We loaded onto the transport. The other 10 human cadets from our section were running a different rotation that day. The Advanced Navigation Assessment, which required a full group and had been scheduled separately. We had been split off from the main section for Pen 11 because our placement scores had flagged us for the Predator Track's advanced cohort. Neither of the other groups asked about it, and we had not raised the subject. There was a grammar to the combined track that we had learned by month 3, and part of it was that you did not draw attention to discrepancies in assignment until you understood what the discrepancy meant. Pen 11 was not part of the main academy campus. It was 3 kilometers northeast, at the edge of the plateau, where the escarpment dropped 60 meters to the stone flats below, and the facility there was built into the rock itself. Low walls, reinforced glass running the length of the observation gallery, the smell of something old and animal and very large that reached you 50 meters before the visual did. The transport pulled into the staging bay, and we unloaded into a short corridor that had that smell concentrated enough to taste. The permanent handler was waiting for us. His name was Saventhek. He was a Dralek, which meant he was wide and low and moved on 4 legs with the patient deliberation of something that had decided long ago that speed was for emergencies and posture was for everything else. He had the flat orbital ridges that Dralek developed when they spent significant time in proximity to apex predators. A physiological stress response that produced a kind of permanent watchfulness in the set of the face, as if the face had been reorganized around the single priority of not being surprised. He had been Torek's primary handler for 6 of the 9 years Torek had been at the facility. I learned later that the handler before him had left the post by choice after a structural incident with the observation glass, that the documentation described in terms that were precise about the damage and careful about everything else. Saventhek looked at the 8 of us the way you look at something you have already categorized and filed under a known heading. "Human cadets," he said. "Not a question." "I will tell you what I tell every group," he said. "You will stand at the far barrier. You will not speak above a low conversational register. You will not make sudden movement. If Torek moves toward the glass, you will take 3 steps back and hold. You will fill out your forms and you will leave. If anyone cannot follow those instructions, they will wait in the staging bay." He looked at us for a moment. None of us said anything. We had learned in 11 months that the best response to a briefing from someone who lived with a large, dangerous animal was to listen and then do exactly what they said. Saventhek nodded, a forward weight shift that Dralek used to indicate approbation. "Follow me." The observation gallery was a long corridor of reinforced glass set into the rock, 3 meters wide and perhaps 20 long, with a clear line of sight into the pen below. The pen itself was significant, perhaps 40 meters across, the floor covered in substrate that looked like compressed earth over stone, with structural elements that provided environmental complexity. Elevated platforms, a water feature. Several recessed areas that Torek could retreat into if he chose. The glass was rated to withstand, according to the specifications posted at the entry, 1,200 kilograms of direct impact force. The notation below that number read, "Tested quarterly, last tested 41 days prior." Below that, in smaller characters, "Caution. Standard rating glass has not been impact tested against a motivated adult velith. Rating applies to structural load and thermal stress only." I read that last line twice. Torek was at the far end of the pen when we entered the gallery. This is the detail I want to be precise about, because it matters for what came next. He was at the far end, facing the wall, doing the velith equivalent of nothing in particular, the low-frequency muscle movement along his haunches that the behavioral assessment form identified as resting activation state, the bioluminescent markings dim, the tail moving in the slow, regular sweeping arc of something that was present but not engaged. He had not turned toward the gallery. We spread along the gallery in the spacing Savinthek indicated, not bunched, 2 meters back from the barrier assessment forms out. The forms were on data pads, 14 fields, behavioral categories ranging from threat display to feeding pattern indicators to environmental response latency. Kavath Sal had told us the forms were not designed for success. That was fine. We filled out what we could see. Savinthek positioned himself at the entry end of the gallery and watched us watching the pen. I noticed, after a minute, that he was watching us more than he was watching Torek, which was information. There were 6 other cadet groups scheduled for Pen 11 that day. I know this because Savinthek referenced the day's schedule later in his incident report. The first 2 groups of Korathi and Ves cadets from the other advanced placement sections had run through the standard profile in the morning session: Torek at distance, moderate threat state display, bioluminescent markings at partial activation, no approach toward the glass. The handler documentation for those 2 sessions was a combined 4 lines of log notes. The sessions had produced behavioral data and nothing else. We were the 3rd group of the day. I know the details of the first 2 sessions because Savinthek described them in his incident report, and because, later, I asked him directly and he answered with the precision of a handler who had been logging behavioral sessions for 9 years and kept his notes accurate. The first group, a Korathi advanced placement section, 6 cadets, high performance metrics across the board, had entered the gallery at the 2nd hour. Torek had moved to mid-pen within the first 3 minutes, which was his standard assessment distance. His bioluminescent markings had activated at roughly 30% luminosity, which Savinthek noted was a moderate threat assessment indicator, not a full threat display. He had held at mid-pen for the duration. He had made no approach toward the glass. The Korathi cadets had completed their forms and filed out in 11 minutes, which was below the session average. The log note for that session was 7 words. Standard profile, no deviation, forms submitted. The second group was Ves, 4 cadets from the upper placement section, older, 2 of them cross-enrolled from the senior year. Torek had held at the far wall for most of their session. 1 partial approach toward mid-pen, bioluminescent markings dim throughout. The Ves cadets had stood their full session time and completed detailed forms. Savinthek's log note was 9 words. Subject showed reduced engagement with this group. Standard outcome. These 2 sessions were the context for what happened when we walked in. I want that context to be clear because it would be easy to read what Torek did as something dramatic, as a confrontation or an event. It was not. It was quieter than that, and the quietness was the thing. In 23 years of the rotation, the pen had never gone quiet. It went quiet the morning our squad walked in, and quiet was the response, and it was more legible to the animal in front of us than anything that would have been louder. We had been in the gallery for perhaps 6 minutes when Torek turned. Not toward us, not yet. He turned from the far wall and moved to the water feature at a diagonal, unhurried, the 6-limbed movement producing almost no sound through the glass, a kind of moving silence that was itself its own kind of information. He drank for a moment. Then he lifted his head and was still. I was watching his ears, which were the kind of large, articulated sensory organs that could orient independently, one forward, one at 45 degrees. The right ear had been angled toward the gallery since we walked in. The front ear moved when he lifted from the water, and then both ears oriented forward and locked. Torek turned toward the glass. Behind me, I heard Savinthek exhale, a sound I would not have registered if I had not been paying attention to the room behind me as well as the pen in front, which is a habit from Vostereth that I cannot turn off. The exhale was not alarm. It was something else. Closer to the sound, a person makes when something they have been expecting for a long time has finally arrived in the wrong category. Torek crossed the pen. Not at a run. Not in threat display. The bioluminescent markings stayed dim. The tail was low. No vocalization that I could detect. He walked with the purposeful economy of something going somewhere it had already decided to go. 40 meters in the time it took me to register that he was moving and adjust my stance. He stopped at the glass. He was 2 meters from me. If you remove the glass from the equation, which the rating specifications suggested was something you should not entirely do, he was 2 meters away. And at 2 meters you understood certain things about a Velith-class predator that the display specifications had not fully communicated. The size of the head alone. The independent jaw articulation was visible even at rest, a subtle asymmetry in the musculature that meant both rows of dentition could operate without the other. The forward-set optical array, 6 eyes in a configuration that produced approximately 270 degrees of binocular overlap. The breath, visible even through the glass, not missed exactly, but a regularity that told you something about the scale of the respiratory system powering the body in front of you. His eyes moved across the 8 of us. Not quickly, not the scanning movement of an animal cataloging threats, the slow, deliberate movement of something reading a room, starting with Quaim at the near end of the gallery, working down the line. He stopped on Quaim. Quaim was standing at the glass the way Quaim stood everywhere, which was with his weight centered and his hands loose at his sides, and an expression that communicated precisely nothing. On Durath 7, the large territorial fauna had a documented behavioral response to eye contact that the colonists had worked out across several generations of trial and expensive error. You held still, you did not project, and you met the eyes without aggression or submission, which was the hardest of the 3 and the one that mattered most. Quaim had been doing this since he was a child. He was doing it now. Torek looked at Quaim for approximately 4 seconds. Then Torek sat down. Savinthek made a sound. I turned. He was at the entry of the gallery, and he was looking at the pen with the expression of someone who has reached into a file they have used for 23 years, and found that the thing they expected to pull out is no longer there. His orbital ridges were doing the Dralic version of elevated attention, a slight forward press that widened the visual field. He was not alarmed. He was recalibrating and doing it in real time, which I had not seen a handler do before. Torek had not sat in the presence of a cadet group in 23 years of the rotation. I did not know this at the time. I learned it from the handler logs afterward. The log notation for every prior session read some variation of subject maintained observation distance, standard assessment behavior, no approach. For those 2 morning sessions that day, the notation was the same. For our session, Savinthek's first notation was a single line. Subject has approached glass and assumed sedentary stance. This behavior has no prior occurrence in the rotation record. He filed that note in the first 7 minutes. The session ran for 51 more. What happened in those 51 minutes I want to describe accurately, which means resisting the pressure to make it more dramatic than it was. What it was this. Torek sat in front of the glass and looked at us. He moved his gaze from one to the next, unhurried, and when it settled on one of us it stayed there for a while before moving on. Not threat assessing. The bioluminescent markings never activated. The tail never stiffened. His ears tracked sound from outside the pen once briefly and then returned. He was just present at the glass with us, in the way you are present with something that holds your attention not because it threatens you, but because it interests you. We filled out our assessment forms. I am aware that this sounds pathetic. You are standing at the glass with the most high-consequence resident in the facility, and your response is to continue filling out the assessment forms. But that is what we did because those were the instructions, and because none of us was experiencing anything that required a different response. The form had 14 fields. We were there to observe. We observed. Torek provided a significant amount of observational data. The fields in the first section covered threat indicators, bioluminescent activation percentage, tail strike posture, jaw articulation display, vocalization type and frequency. We marked all of them at 0 or not observed. In the 11 months I had been filling out assessment forms at the academy, I had never completed a section in a predator rotation where all the threat indicators were 0. I noted this and continued to the next section. The second section covered behavioral state indicators, resting activation, active patrol, feeding behavior, social display. The social display subsection had a note in small characters at the bottom that read, "This field is for accredited handler use only. Cadets should mark NA." I looked at the field. I looked at Torek. I looked at scifi. I marked NA and moved on. The third section was environmental response assessment, which asked about the subject's reaction to sound, movement, and olfactory input from the observer group. We filled this out carefully, because it was the section where what Torek was actually doing mapped most cleanly onto the form's available categories. I wrote, "Subject showed sustained orientation toward observer group with no threat state activation. Sustained tonal vocalization, low frequency, non-aggressive register. Behavioral posture transitioned from seated to prone approximately 14 minutes into the session. All movement toward observers was measured pace, no sprint indicators." I filled in the rest of the section as accurately as I could and noted in the comments field that several behavioral categories appeared to fall outside the form's current classification range. Priya, 2 positions down the gallery, had filled in that same comments field with recommend addition of non-threat approach behavior category to future form revision. Yusuf had written, "Subject behavior most consistent with contact initiation rather than threat or assessment. Current form insufficient for this session's data profile." When we compared notes later, we found that all 8 of us had written variations of the same thing. The form was not built for what happened, and the form needed to change. About 12 minutes in, Yusuf lowered his datapad slightly and said, very quietly, "He's tracking B." Torek's gaze had settled on B. Santos, who was standing at the far end of the gallery near the exit, which was where she had positioned herself by reflex, rear of the line, full sightlines on both the entry and the observation space simultaneously. B's home colony was Vestran Hold, and on Vestran Hold the working principle around large fauna was, maintain awareness of where the thing is and where you are relative to the available exits. This was not anxiety, it was geometry. She was standing with the particular quality of alertness that was her resting state, watching Torek the way she watched anything potentially large and potentially consequential. Steadily, without performing either fear or ease, just looking at the actual situation. Torek looked at her for a long time. Then he made a sound. It was low, below the register I would have expected to feel as sound rather than hear, but the glass transmitted it at enough frequency that it was audible. A single, sustained tonal output, not vocalization in any conventional sense. Closer to what the behavioral literature calls contact rumble, which is the sound a velith produces in the presence of recognized kin or recognized pack. It is not a sound a velith produces for strangers. The facility documentation noted that Torek had produced contact rumble only 3 times in 9 years of residence. Once when Saventhek first established handler status, once during a wellness assessment that had required extended proximity, and once in circumstances the documentation described only as anomalous event, no safety incident. He was producing it now. B looked at Torek for a moment. Then she did something none of us had discussed and none of us had told her to do. She raised one hand, slowly, palm outward. Not a greeting, not a signal, not a gesture with any specific protocol meaning. Just the flat, unhurried extension you make when you want something very large and very capable of harm to understand that you are not the threat in this interaction. A slow, open-palmed movement at shoulder height, held. Torek's ears both oriented forward, he held still. Then he lowered himself from the seated position to something closer to prone, chest toward the substrate, forelimbs extended, head level. In the behavioral literature, this is described as approach solicitation, which means something large and powerful making itself geometrically smaller in the presence of something it considers worth that particular concession. It is a voluntary reduction of threat profile. It is not a submission posture. The distinction matters. Submission means you have lost. Approach solicitation means you have decided the other thing is worth acknowledging as real. Savinthek crossed the gallery in 4 steps and stood behind us. He did not tell us to move back. He did not tell us to step away from the glass. He stood and looked at the pen. After a moment he said, and I want to be precise about his register because it matters, not alarmed, not warning us, just the particular flatness of someone saying a thing they have just confirmed for themselves. In 9 years, he has never done that for a visitor. Priya said, without looking up from her form, what does it mean when they do that? Savinthek was quiet for a moment. Then he said, it means he has decided you are not prey. Priya made a notation on her form. We stayed for the full 51 minutes. Torek held the prone position for most of it. Occasionally he would shift, orient toward a different one of us, track a movement, settle on Oren for a while with the particular focusing quality of something trying to read something it almost understood. Oren stood with the ease he always had around living things, which was the ease of someone who had spent real time in the company of large working animals and had learned that your internal state communicated itself regardless of what your face was doing. The contact rumble came and went. No threat displays. No activation of the bioluminescent markings. No tail strike posture. When we filed out at the end of the session, Torek tracked us to the exit end of the gallery and held there until we were through the door. In the staging bay, Savinthek stopped. He looked at the 8 of us. His orbital ridges were still doing the elevated attention press. He had been doing the Dralic version of active processing for 51 minutes, and he had not stopped. I have run 112 cadet groups through this rotation, he said. In the 9 years I have been Torek's primary handler. The standard session profile is: group enters gallery, Torek assesses from distance, partial threat display, no approach, group completes form, group exits. That is the complete profile. That is every session. He stopped, we waited. He assessed you differently, Savinthek said. I do not have a framework that accounts for what he did today. Quaim said, what does he usually do when new handlers are introduced? For the first time. Savinthek looked at him. Contact assessment, extended proximity, behavioral calibration over several sessions before any bond behavior develops. Why? Quaim said, because that is what he did today. Savinthek held the Dralic stillness, weight settled, no movement, everything concentrated in the orbital ridges and the quality of attention. Then he said quietly, you are second-year cadets. Yes, Quaim said. He has never treated second-year cadets as handlers. I know, Quaim said, but he treated us as something. The transport was waiting. Savinthek said nothing further. We were cadets and he was permanent facility staff, and there is a grammar to those relative positions that we respected. We loaded onto the transport and went back to the main campus. That night in the squad bay, after lights out when we were technically supposed to be in quiet hours, Oren started the debrief. He did not announce it as a debrief. He just said in the dark, he knew. Nobody asked what he meant. Dmitri said, the Velith sensory resolution is higher than most classification systems. Olfactory, thermal, behavioral cue integration. He was reading more about us than the form was designed to measure. Priya said he produced contact rumble. That is not a classification response. That is a social bond signal. Yusuf said from somewhere near the far wall, he was looking for something specific, in each of us. Takshi said, he looked at me for almost as long as he looked at B. I was thinking about Mari Kaigan. The 3-month rotation where the ventilation failed on the lower decks and we lost 4 people before the engineering team isolated the breach. I was thinking about that specifically, without meaning to. Quaim said, I was thinking about the night the Southern Array went down on Durath 7. I was 12. We spent 4 hours on the roof of the equipment shed because the ground was not safe and the roof was the highest point we could reach. I have not thought about that in years. There was a quiet after that, not uncomfortable. The quiet of people who have just realized they were doing the same thing without coordinating it. B said, my grandmother had a saying about large animals. She said the ones that have been around enough death learn to tell it from everything else. The ones that carry it and the ones that don't. Take, she said, and we were the ones that carried it. Some of us more than others, B said, but all of us somewhat, yes. Quaim said he was not afraid of us. No, Oren said, he was interested. Kavath Sal's assessment brief was 3 days later. It ran 40 minutes. She covered the standard rotation outcomes, behavioral form evaluations, comparative cadet performance across the full cohort, Savanthek's handler feedback from all 12 groups that had run through Pen 11 that week. Then she said she was going to address an anomalous outcome in the rotation, which she identified by session ID rather than by nomming the group, though everyone in the room who had been in Pen 11 that morning knew which session she meant. She pulled up Savanthek's incident report on the display. She read the summary to the room without commentary. Then she said, the handler's assessment of this session has been forwarded to the Faculty Review Board and the Predator Behavior Research Team at the Combined Sciences Institute. Their preliminary response, received this morning, is that the behavioral profile Torek displayed during this session matches, with high fidelity, the assessment profile he uses with certified handlers during formal bond establishment protocols. That protocol normally develops over multiple sessions across several weeks. It did not develop that way here. She was quiet for a moment. The research team wants to run a follow-up observation. I have approved it. The group in question will return to Pen 11 with a research observer present. That session will be logged separately from the standard rotation and will not count toward the cohort's grade profile. Someone from the Korathi section said, what does it mean that he responded that way? To cadets. Kavath Sal looked at the room. Her lock eyes did the thing they did when she was deciding how precisely to say something, not evasion, the Vest version of choosing the right instrument for the weight of a thing. It means, she said, that the animal made a determination about the group that our curriculum did not anticipate and our assessment instruments were not designed to measure. It means the rotation is being revised. The room changed quality when she said that. Not silence, there were the small movements of a large cohort in a briefing room, but the quality of attention shifted, and where it went was interesting. The Vest cadets near the front had their heads at the slight forward angle that meant active processing. The Dralic cadets were doing their stillness. The other human cadets in the room, the ones who had not been in Pen 11, the ones from Standard Environment Origin Worlds, were looking at us. Not at our section specifically, at humans as a category, recalibrating something. I noted that and looked straight ahead. What I thought about, in the days after the briefing, was the particular nature of what had been recalibrated. It was not that the other cadets had thought less of us before. The combined track did not work that way. Everyone in it had been selected. Everyone in it had earned their placement. And the 11 months of shared friction had produced genuine mutual respect across the species divisions in our cohort. The Korathi cadets who had initially treated our squad as tactical assets to be positioned and managed had stopped doing that by month 4. The Vest cadets who had, in the first weeks, been visibly skeptical of the human enrollment numbers in the advanced section had updated their assessment after the wilderness persistence rotations. We were respected. That was not what changed. What changed was something harder to name. It was the recognition that the assessment instrument Torek had used, the one that produced handler bond behavior in 45 seconds of proximity rather than weeks of careful conditioning, was not a curriculum instrument. It was not something the Academy had designed or could replicate in a controlled trial. It was something the animal had brought from the world that made him, and he had been applying it to every group that walked through that gallery for 23 years, and for 23 years the result had been nothing. And then 8 humans from worlds the course description did not feature had walked in, and the result had been something else entirely, and the instrument had worked, and what it had found was real. That is what the room was recalibrating around, not our performance, our history, the thing we had carried in without knowing we were carrying it. The follow-up session was 8 days later. The research observer was a vest named Karithvoy from the Combined Sciences Institute, who arrived with a data collection array and behavioral coding sheets considerably more detailed than the standard rotation form. Saventhek met us in the staging bay. He looked at us differently than he had the first time, not with the categorizing look of a handler managing a visitor group, but with the attention of someone who is now watching something that does not fit its previous heading. Torek was already at the glass when we entered the gallery. He had been there before we came in. Saventhek said nothing about this. Karithvoy made a notation. I will tell you what happened in the second session less completely than the first, not because it was less significant, but because the significance was distributed across an hour and 12 minutes in a way that resists the kind of compression a single moment allows. What happened was, Torek moved through the behavioral repertoire that Saventhek and Karithvoy both recognized as handler bond behavior, extended proximity contact against the glass. The contact rumble returning and sustaining through most of the session. The prone approach solicitation when B moved to the far end of the gallery. A moment approximately 40 minutes in when Torek turned away from the glass, walked to the center of the pen, turned back, and held a position that Karithvoy later identified in the research notes as lateral display. The posture used in Velith behavioral taxonomy when a bonded handler is being introduced to the animal's territory. Not threat display, territory sharing. It means this is where I live. I am showing it to you. Karithvoy put down her datapad partway through and watched with her unaided eyes for a while. I noted this as meaningful from someone who had presumably spent significant professional time watching animal behavior with data collection instruments, and who had chosen, in this instance, to just look. In the staging bay afterward, with Karithvoy still making notes at the end of the corridor, Saventhek said to us, to the 8 of us quietly, not as a briefing, as something he was working out while he said it. I want to ask you something. We said yes. What are your home worlds? We told him Quame's Durath 7, Priya's Kessler's Edge, my Vosterath 2nd Station, Dimitri's Atrath Shelf, Yusuf's Harath's Landing, B's Vestran Hold, Takeshi's Maury Kaigan Station, Oren's Outer Settlement Belt. Saventhek listened to all of it without interrupting. Then he said, not one of you is from a standard environment origin. No, Quame said. Saventhek said, Torek was caught on a world with a threat index of 5.8. He spent the first 5 years of his life in conditions that would rate your home worlds as comparable, some of you harder. Nobody said anything. Saventhek said, he knows what that smells like. Physiologically, behaviorally, in the particular stress marker chemistry that high-threat history organisms carry in their systems long after the immediate threat has passed. He has always been able to read it. In 9 years in this facility, he has never had a reason to read it in a group of cadets who were also carrying it. He looked at the 8 of us for a moment. Until now, he said. That was the end of it. We boarded the transport. On the ride back, Oren said to no one in particular, he wasn't recognizing what we had done. He was recognizing what we had been through. Priya said, is there a difference? Oren thought about it. Not really, he said, not in the end. The research report from the Combined Sciences Institute came through 6 weeks later. I was not party to the full document. It was faculty level. but Kavathsal summarized the relevant findings in a rotation track update that went to the full second-year combined cohort. The summary said that Torek's behavioral response to the human cadet group was consistent with apex organism recognition behavior, which the report defined as the particular behavioral adjustment that occurs when a high-threat history predator encounters another organism whose physiological and behavioral stress markers indicate comparable threat history exposure. Not the same species, not the same threat environment, the same accumulated history. The rotation was revised. The assessment form changed. 3 fields updated. 2 new behavioral observation categories added that had not existed in the original instrument, because the instrument had been designed without the expectation that what happened in Pen 11 on that morning would ever need to be measured. Savinthek submitted a handler protocol amendment recommending that future groups assigned to the Predator track include Origin World Threat Index data in their pre-session background files. The amendment was approved. Kavathsal delivered the new rotation brief to the next intake, and one of her colleagues told me, months later, that she had added a note to the briefing that read, "The rotation's purpose is observation and assessment. Torek will determine what is observed." I graduated from the Vithrani Combined Arms Academy 14 months after that morning. The others graduated within the same quarter. We went to different postings, Quaim to a Combined Forces Rapid Response Unit, Priya to Fleet Communications, B to a border installation I am not cleared to name, the rest to postings I follow at whatever resolution their status reports allow. We see each other when assignments intersect, which is not as often as 11 months of shared context might suggest, but more often than the scale of the federated theater would predict. There is a frequency to the intersections that I do not think is coincidence. The placement algorithm knew something about the 8 of us before we did. The last time I was back at the Vithrani Plateau, I had a transit stop of 6 hours, and I walked the 3 kilometers to the Predator facility because I had the time, and because I wanted to. Savinthek was at the handler station. He had been there for 15 years by that point. He looked older in the way that long-term close proximity handlers look older, not worn down but worn in, like the iron-gray rock of the escarpment, which has been shaped by more years of wind than anyone who lives near it can fully account for. He recognized me. I had not been entirely certain he would, given the time, but he did. "You are one of the 8, he said. "Yes." "He is well," Savinthek said. 20 years old now, senior range for the species, still in residence. His condition is good." He told me, without my asking, that the rotation had continued to produce data, that the revised form was working better, not perfectly, but better, that 2 of the new behavioral categories Karath Voy had recommended had been adopted into the standard instrument across 3 other facilities that ran comparable rotations with high-consequence predators, that Savinthek's handler protocol amendment had been cited in a paper from the Combined Sciences Institute on apex organism recognition behavior in controlled environments, and that the paper had generated more correspondence than anything published in that journal in the previous 4 years, most of it from handler teams at other facilities who had logged similar anomalous events and had not previously had a framework to file them under. The paper gave them a heading, Savinthek said. That is what was missing, not the events. The events had been happening for years. The heading. I thought about that. I asked if the rotation still ran through Pen 11. "Every intake," Savinthek said. "He still assesses every group. He has responded to 3 other groups the way he responded to yours in the years since." "Human groups?" I asked. Savinthek looked at me. 2 human, 1 Korathi from a fringe world. A pause. The Korathi was from a world with a threat index of 6, higher than your Quaim's home colony. I thought about that for a moment. "He is consistent," Savinthek said. "What he looks for he finds by the same means every time. The marker does not change." I asked if I could go to the gallery. He considered this. I was not a cadet. I was a serving officer transiting with 6 hours. The question existed slightly outside the facility's standard operating framework. He said yes. We walked to the gallery. The light through the reinforced glass was the plateau's cold afternoon quality, flat and gray and without shadow. The pen was the same substrate, same structural elements, same water feature. The rating specification placard was still posted at the entry. The last tested notation had a different date. Torek was at the far end of the pen. He turned before I had been at the glass for 30 seconds. He crossed the pen the same way he had 6 years before. Unhurried, purposeful. The bioluminescent markings quiet. He stopped at the glass, and he was larger than memory had kept him, or memory had shrunk him the way it sometimes shrinks the things that were genuinely large. And the reality of him at 2 meters of distance recalibrated the mental file I had been carrying for 6 years without fully examining. He looked at me for a long time. Then he lowered himself to prone. I put my palm flat against the glass. I do not know why I did this. It was not a conscious decision in the way most decisions feel. It was the thing that my hand did, the same way B's hand had moved 6 years before, without discussion and without plan. Torek put the flat of his jaw against the glass on the other side. The glass between us was rated to 1,200 kilograms of direct impact force. Between us, it was nothing at all. Savinthek stood behind me and said nothing for a while. Then he said quietly, "I have been a handler for 21 years. I have worked with 8 species of predator in that time. In 21 years, I have seen an apex animal choose to be still in the presence of something it recognized on its own terms exactly twice." He paused. The first was the day I established bond status with Torek. The second was the morning your squad walked in. I kept my hand on the glass. The contact rumble had started when I first put it there, and it was still running, felt more than heard. A frequency that moved through the glass and through the bones of my hand and up my arm, and settled somewhere in the chest at a register below what the ears fully process. "He does not forget," Savinthek said. "They do not forget." I stayed until the light changed. When I stepped back from the glass, Torek watched me go. His ears tracked toward the exit as I walked through the gallery to the door, and at the door I turned back and he was still at the glass where I had left him, the bioluminescent markings quiet, the contact rumble still running at a frequency I could no longer hear but remembered. I walked back to the main campus, found the transport to the port, and caught my connection with time to spare. I have been back twice since. Each time is the same. He is at the far end of the pen, and then he is at the glass, and the gallery goes quiet in the particular way that rooms go quiet when the largest thing in them has decided to be still. 23 years, the pen had never gone quiet for a visitor group. Then 8 of us walked in from worlds the curriculum had not built its instruments around, and we stood at the glass, and Torek sat down, and the form changed, and Savinthek filed his amendment, and Kavathsal rewrote the briefing. The room recalibrated itself around a fact it had not had a category for. It has not quite stopped recalibrating. I have stopped expecting it to settle into a clean classification. Some things are more useful unresolved, held open, kept accurate. Torek is 20 years old now and senior range for his species and still in residence at the edge of the plateau, and whatever he read in us that morning is still what he reads, and still what he finds, in the ones who carry the same markers. The curriculum keeps producing new groups. He keeps making his determinations. The form keeps getting revised, a field at a time, each revision a small admission that the original instrument was built around an assumption that turned out to be wrong, that what walked in would always be smaller than what waited on the other side of the glass. He has not been wrong yet.